you are the Lithuanian. I think you should start because it's your country.
Okay, welcome to my country, Henrik.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here.
Yes.
Mindaugas invited us to talk here about, he wrote in the email, art and architecture, or architecture and art, or something like this. I don't know if it's important which was in front, art or architecture. And I think for me, I don't know, a starting point of these conversations, I think it could be just to settle some things like, do you think architecture is art? And then from this, maybe we can just...
Yeah, but we can start there.
Yeah.
Well, is all images art? Or is all building architecture? I will rather still the question like that because if is art architecture, I think maybe the approach to that is a little bit too easy. I will start this way. Not all building around us is architecture.
Yeah.
Some of them are just buildings.
Yeah.
Not all images which are produced is artwork.
Yeah.
And not all writings are poems or novels or masterpieces in literature. So I will say that sometimes architecture is art, and sometimes visual art is an art piece. But even now, I think you will see a lot of activities in art museums where you have a display of something, but it's not necessarily art. It's just a visual display. So I think what art is, and which can bring it, the relationship between art and architecture together is if you see art as a singularity. Art is a singularity in culture and in the universe, which is so specific. So it's, so to speak, creating an event not only in the social, political society, but also in the history of architecture. So I will say that when a piece of architecture is art, it's because it can make a difference internal in relationship to the architectural history, and it can be an event in the society where it's function. And I think it's the same way with a piece of art, that when you have an artwork or sculpture, an installation or performance, when it can make a difference, which is so interesting that it can recontextualize the history of its field, and when it is a sensation from a social, political, and cultural perspective, then I would say we probably are talking about an artwork in one way or another. That would be my response. So yes, sometimes architecture is art. I have here a list because you asked me if I could mention somebody in your mail to me.
Yeah.
I made a list here of 5 architects which I think have produced artworks.
Okay, interesting.
The first one is Louis Barragan. He is a Mexican architect. He worked with very, you know him, he's not a minimalist, but he's worked with very minimal tools in his architecture, and he worked very much with color. And he has been an inspiration for a lot of architects, of course, not only in Mexico, but also for people like Louis Kahn, the great American architect, in the process of building Salt Institute in California. Louis Kahn had a problem in his courtyard, and then he invited Louis from Mexico, and Louis came up and was suggesting the solution that we have today in the Salt Institute, that you have a line in the middle of the courtyard, and out there you have the Pacific Ocean. And I think Louis Barragan is an artist in his field. Another example of an architect which I think is very close connected to art and have produced things which is transforming the architecture into an artistic event is Daniel Libeskind in his Jewish museum in Berlin. Many of the elements you see in that museum is deeply inspired by land art and minimal art from America. A third example of architecture as art could be Louis Kahn's Dhaka work, which is the Bangladesh National Assembly, the government building for Bangladesh government. That is an outstanding spatial construction, which I think is simply crossing the borderline of functionalism and modernism and become a really great spatial event. And then, of course, another example of an artist in his field is Le Corbusier's masterpiece Rongxiang, where you have a building which are so complex and which have so many spatial qualities, is dealing with light and are dealing with the proportion and the walls, that I will say that it's no longer a piece of architecture we see here, it's something else, and which I think is a work that I will call an artistic practice in an architectural field. And the last one I will mention, there are many others, is of Frei Otto, the German architect who is working with what we call soap bubbles aesthetics. And soap bubble aesthetics is, by the way, a huge issue in modern philosophy and also in modern art. I mean, for some years we have been talking about bubble philosophy and how different domains are brought together in assemblage. Gilles Deleuze would call it an assemblage. So I say Frei Otto is an example of an architect who not only inspire other architects but also been a great inspiration for a lot of artists. What all these guys have in common as architects is they are deeply involved in art. They're interested in art. And for instance, Libeskind is an expert in Arnold Schoenberg. Le Corbusier was a cubist painter. And Louis Kahn was almost, I would say he was a poet and was very occupied with Jewish mysticism. And Frei Otto had an experimental approach to architecture, which he was sitting in his bathroom and washing his hair, and there he was developing soap bubble, and from that play with that he could construct his architecture. So that would be my response to you.
But I will. You talked very nicely about everything here, and I will maybe put something in this, that maybe all of them except maybe Frei Otto, I would say their architecture is also somehow, to some certain degree, unpractical. The practicality is not very important, I think. And does that mean that by being a bit that, I don't know, that for architecture to be art or tend towards art, it has to become impractical?
But I don't think that's correct.
I understand that in a sense of spiritual sense, like art, it is practical as a spiritual whatever thing, but as a building, as a structure,
But all those buildings have a function, a social function, and I mean the government building is working as a government administration building. The museum is people are visiting the museum every day. And the stadiums, in the sports station in Germany, are having football games every Sunday. So they are actually having a function from an architectural point of view. But what they can is that they are also more than a function. They are also an event in themselves. And that is what I will say, that an art practice or an art work have to be an event in itself, so it can recontextualize its relationship to the world, coming from one scale and bring itself into another scale. And I think that is exactly what happened in that kind of architecture, that there is a functional level, yes, but it also brings the experience of the building into a new level. So in that sense, it's like a poem. I mean, you can read a poem, and sometimes if you read it really very close, you'll say it's completely bullshit what the poem says.
Yeah.
But when you read it from a poetical point of view or from a musical point of view, then it's a very beautiful order. It's an order on another level. So, I mean, even visual art has a level in it where it have a direct relationship to the reality. This work, for instance, have a direct relationship to the weather system out here. When it's very hot here, it will melt in there. When it's cold, we will have a fantastic structure. So no artwork is isolated from a context, but it will still be able to produce differences although it is brought into a kind of stable domain. I think you can maybe say it this way, that all aesthetics practice has, so to speak, two levels. Writing a poem, you need to write properly, which is a level of syntax and language you need to control. But then the way you do it is, so to speak, bring a new level in. All architecture have constructions, but you bring in a new level. Visual art have material. They are maybe a three-dimensional object, but it can still bring a new level in. So I think that, I think that I don't buy that argument that there are no practical. No.
But isn't it that practicality is somehow important? Because if there's no practical use, is it even then architect? You know, okay, let's push this further. Okay, I also agree that, those buildings, they do what they do. They do it well. That's why probably the architects are very well known for, because of these buildings. And I still think it's some certain degree of, I don't know, maybe unpracticality is maybe not the right word, but maybe a bit irrational or something. Working with some other levels, which is fine. Some buildings should do that. I don't think all of them, but some should. But what if everything what building does is just it doesn't have a function? Does it mean that then it becomes a sculpture?
No.
Does it mean that the architect becomes an artist?
No. I think
how does it work?
I think what you're talking about now is scale. I think that architecture belongs to another scale than, for instance, a sculpture do.
Yeah, but we can talk like this guy, I forgot the name, in near Nevada, Las Vegas. He just opened this city. This
James Turrell.
No.
Nevada.
He was building it for guys.
Heiser.
Yeah.
Heiser, yeah. I know.
So it's the scale of not
Architect.
even like it's urban scale, almost like next level from like typical architecture. But it's not urban. It's not, how do we?
I see that as kind of monument. And a monument has an architectural dimension.
Yeah.
After the monument, you will have a huge building. You will have a Washington building, government building. But a monument is on the scale where it is very close to an architectural thing. But monument have something which is interesting. Very often we cannot go inside the monument. We have to look at it from the outside. Where in architecture we have an inside space. So there is a topological, there's a mathematics there which is different. So architecture can be experienced from the outside and from the inside. Most monuments are bigger than statues, and statues are bigger than sculpture, and sculpture are very often bigger than objects. So in that field of modern art, we have objects, sculpture, statues, and monument. And then we go to the next level, which is the building, architecture, and the next level will be the city. As a structure. Yeah. So I think that what Heiser has been working with, and he is the same generation of Robert Smith and many others, I think it's a kind of American monumentalism in the desert. But it's also something else. It's also a kind of architectonic statement. And there is a difference between an architecture and architectonic. So it certainly have architectonic qualities, but the architectonic element is, in my opinion, related to a kind of mythical dimension. And the other thing is that there's an element of, there's a communication with the cosmos, I will say, in his work, because of the grand scale that he is working with. So I think it's a monument, and I'm not quite sure that that the function is absent. Maybe we should look at it in another way, and say that in Heiser's huge monumental work, the functions has yet to come. The functions are not predicted in the work. It will probably develop from the future. It's like a receiver for a new kind of function. But. Like the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
It's also a piece of architecture from the past. Yeah. But it receives constantly new functions because of its historical meaning. Yeah. I guess there will be a kind of response to that.
Yeah, just, I don't know, this functionality for me, I don't know, I think we're talking about the monumental, architectonic, but I was trying to think about, I gave this question to you, but I was also thinking how I could answer it.
Yes,
and for
please.
me, maybe it could be that the most basic thing, because I don't think it's in, like now you're also saying, in most cases you can enter a monument and so on and so on, but in some you do.
Yeah.
In the case of Nevada, you can walk through it like a city. So in a way, and in the city you cannot enter every building. I mean, you probably could with a proper tools or invitation, but somehow it's same choreography, I guess. But then I was thinking maybe what really defines, because I was thinking that there's probably many things which are the same, or at least looking the same, created by artists and could be created by an architect. And how you distinguish? And I was thinking that maybe how we distinguish is that art is created by art is created by artists, and architecture is created by architects. So if architect creates a wall, I think it still is considered more leaning towards architecture, even though it could be the same object created by a sculptor, and then it would become more art. And then it's same objects in theory. We could have exactly the same things created by different people, and I think then depends if the person identifies himself as this or that, and then this somehow shapes how we see those things. Because if architect creates art, it's still everybody looks at some way as architecture, just different architecture, melting architecture. It's still architecture for some reason. If artist, then it could be art piece with a hint of architectonics, a hint of architecture, inspired by architecture, but still art. So for me, this seems kind of interesting that it's.
Well, maybe we have to understand the field of architecture in another way, in a more broader sense. I mean, architecture can of course be a living place where you live with your family and apartments and things like that. But architecture can maybe also be a kind of representation of something, and maybe a kind of a special site for something. Maybe it could be understood as a kind of symbol. And so I think that the idea of architecture as something which is just a living space is maybe to reduce the idea of architecture a bit too much. Yeah. Because otherwise we sort of speak we sort of speak, I would say it's a reductive thinking. You reduce the thing so much so that we cannot operate with the concept. I mean, so I will suggest that we open up the concept of architecture in a more broader sense.
Yeah, I agree that
because architecture can also be a philosophical practice.
Yeah,
I mean,
theory
and theoretical practice. For instance, Daniel Libeskind, I will think that Daniel will say that for him, architecture is a kind of diagram over his drawings, because he started with his very fantastic drawings. And don't forget that he was a genius on a violin when he was a child. So I guess that, I think that maybe he will say that my architecture is a kind of diagram which are constructed from a two-dimensional graphical works, and which are basically incomprehensible. And that is why they are interesting for the culture. Because in this case, architecture is an open field for interpretation. And I will say that really, really good architecture who become artworks are masterpieces. They probably have the same quality as really good artworks, which means that they are in a way creating a kind of assemblage with our reality, with our city, which means that it can constantly go into a new relationship with the surroundings. So although you have a building like this who is isolated from the inside, then there are still a constantly exchange going on with the surroundings, with the weather system, with the visitors, with the processing there. This is a super example of an architectural assemblage process. So I will not have that. I will be. I will think it will be a pity if we reduce the architectural phenomenon to a pure functionalistic domain, because then we are losing the potential of that field in society, and we are losing the opportunity to produce some differences for the culture from an architectural point of view. Don't forget that people have to live in a space like this their whole life. And to create an environment or an ambient environment who has qualities that cannot be measured and who is negotiating with your body, with your movement in the city, that's a long-lasting quality for a city, which is beyond the idea of function.
But then again,
maybe I don't buy that reductive approach you're suggesting here.
I'm not like I'm a little provoking, you know. This I completely agree on theory and everything, but just this overlap. What's how we define, you know.
Yeah, but is that really a problem?
And the programmatic dimension, I think, is always important for architecture.
Yeah,
because we, you know, normally we should have it, I think, and then the more and more we the shapes and the forms, I think it's the same in art and it's the same in architecture. Nobody really cares that much anymore. It's about maybe what you're saying, accommodation at some point. And then it depends, I guess, how we accommodate things. Art accommodates things a bit differently and architecture accommodates things in another way. And then in the end, how architecture looks, nowadays it's become somehow not really important.
Well, I think architecture have been commercialized so much, so that a lot of modern architecture is actually so commercialized. So the only way that you can defend it is to bring so much design element into the building, so no one can see that there's no spatial dimension in the architecture anymore. It's simply a simple construction, so when you have seen the front of the building, you know how it will be the whole way around. Yeah. In 3 dimensions, and when you go into the building, there's no architectural experience, which is interesting. And the only thing you can notice is there's a beautiful design, details in the building, and that's, so to speak, it. So it is difficult today to create Rongshang. It's difficult today to create some of the works I have referred to because of, sorry to say, the commercial structure of the architectural field, but that's another story. We don't go into that now.
But what is interesting that what you're saying, like Rochamp, I think nowadays you could create it, and the biggest chance to create it is in, let's say, undemocratic society. It would be the most easy. Because for this you need a strong man or corruption or nowadays these shapes. If it's a contemporary, it's somehow, you know, if you have big opera house, of course it's a political...
we have to be fair. That our time are building fantastic architecture. There are masterpieces everywhere also, which are under construction right now. But in terms of, you know, shapes or majestic experience, because now we have a lot of good things which are often invisible. Like, you don't really see what has been done, but it has been done so well that it's so natural, it works well, maybe it improves your life, and it improves how you use the city, but maybe you don't even really notice what has been done. That's somehow the approach today of the architects. And this approach of seeing stuff now is more and more, I think, into, like, you know, China has lots of beautiful opera houses, but then in the end they become the symbol of, you know, not the West, but the, you know, I don't know, different societies. Well, I think our generation will probably experience that the architecture field will change a lot because of the climate change. And for instance, in Denmark, we have a huge discussion going on. How should modern architecture relate to the climate crisis? And this work here is, in that sense, very interesting. Because why should a piece of architecture be permanent? Why should a piece of architecture be built for the eternal, for the next 1,000 years? As Mindaugas was mentioned yesterday, when the birds are building architecture in the trees, they just do it for the season. And when they're back next week, next season, next springtime, then they will build a new house, who just will stay there for a few months. So maybe we have to look at the architecture in another context. Architecture who will be something which has a more symbiotic relationship to the weather system, the climate change. And in that sense, this is interesting. Now, we have here a kind of diagram over an architectural event. But when I was here yesterday, the weather was very hot, so the work was almost melting into the raw material. So there are here a kind of tension between a construction, a morphogenetic process which is shaping something, and then there are constantly a kind of re-intervention from the environment who will battle to that construction. And I think that is maybe a kind of model for how we will understand modern architecture in the future. Is there something wrong? You're like, okay.
We have an audience, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
so maybe maybe our generation will come to that point where we will see architecture as something which will find a completely new organical dimension. Maybe we will be so old and lucky, so we will see architecture that grow. Can you follow me?
Yeah, but I'm a little bit skeptical because I haven't seen anything new in the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years in architecture. Okay. So I don't think that we will live for 200 years to witness maybe, I don't know, maybe the critical situation of, climate crisis will, I don't know, focus everybody to focus so hard that maybe it will be more rapid changes, because now it's just new materials, same shapes, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And then I think for sustainability, again, we could, I don't know, go two ways, I guess. Like, again, talking if sustainability is becoming more and more important, does it mean that it's, before it wasn't such a big consideration, and now it is becoming bigger, and sometimes it's the main consideration? And then like the buildings and the architects you mentioned, they were mostly working with artistic expression, and there are architects working today doing the same, just in modern way, doing, I would say, more art and sculpture than building, even though they are called architects. But does this new growing dimension of climate crisis somehow leave less space for art in architecture? I know that it can be both combined, but you cannot have everything somehow. And then you focus, you give priorities, especially in branding and communicating. You need to tell what is your building about in 2 sentences, and you say sustainability. Mm-hmm. More and more and more. Opera house, very sustainable, very efficient, very good. Well, and less about, it's beautiful reflections, like in Iceland or something.
Well, maybe we are too far away from the discussion, but I believe that we will see in the future that human beings have to live in more or less isolated corridors, isolated areas, where we will be needed to build super architectural projects who can who can respond to the needs we have. Because we need to leave more and more territory to nature. We will come to a point in human history where we have to rebuild the woods. We have to rebuild the coherent territories so that nature can live on their own condition, which means that it's not nature who have to live in reservation. It will be human beings who have to retreat to isolated area with high degree of urban structure and urban complexity in order to survive as human beings. We are already too many human beings on Earth. But if the ecosystem should survive in the future, in 500,000 years from now, then we cannot expand as we do now. So I think we will see an architectural, we will probably see a new kind of cities who is responding to who are so complex that we can don't have to take in the territory around us in order to survive as human beings. I mean, in the cities you will grow agriculture. You will grow. You will have animals you can live on. You will have zones of factories. You will have zones of where you can have holidays and etc. Because we have to restrict our territory in order for the globe, the planet to survive.
But
so I think that to be quite frankly, I think something like visual art will have a problem in the future.
Yeah, that's my question. How it's, you know.
And I think that what we could call super, as a earth architecture, will have a future. But we will talk about architecture on a completely other scale than we have today. We will talk about architecture where there are woods inside, to be quite frankly. And right now, a lot of people are starting to develop space architecture. Architecture for the planet, in the planet system. I mean, we have people in Denmark who seriously work with NASA about building, how do you build a city on Mars?
Yeah.
So we are already in the process of expanding into a new dimension in human history. I think that art's function will be something which will be in the assemblage with other fields like science, philosophy, and also architecture. There will still be artworks,
of course,
but we will not have the same function. The modern art scene will not have the same function as we had after Second World War. After Second World War, modern art was the big thing, because after the disaster, the Nazi regime's disaster, and after this, the extension of Jewish people, etc., etc., we need to confirm to ourselves that we are also creative human beings. We are not just evil. So there was art program all over the world. We have just visiting Documenta and Venice. This is an example. But the society don't think that we are important anymore. But we don't have the same function anymore as we had after the World War II, unfortunately.
But this is maybe interesting, no? You mentioned World War II, but if you look at architecture before that, well, a little bit before World War I also, let's say before Industrial Revolution, things which we call today architecture from those times, they are like artworks, well, in a sense, because they have so many sculptures, so many decoration and so on. So art and artists was more important. Then we had the Industrial Revolution, and it became, okay, we have to have something. And like in Lithuania, so during Soviet times, we had like, I don't know, 1% of the budget or something had to go to the art. Now we have zero, which has to go to the art. And what we're talking about the future and all these challenges, that other challenges maybe or needs are becoming less important. And then, so we have, do we agree that, I don't know, is it agreement, but the trajectory is not optimistic for art, or at least art in architecture in this collaboration? I
think in many ways contemporary art is not suitable for an architectural. I mean, I've been working with architects from the very start of the process before the building was implemented, but it never works because I think art is another domain. As visual art is another domain, and I think that probably the demands in the future will already now the demands for architecture is very controlled. What visual art is a domain where the demands are not predicted. You know, so there is a more free space for what you call singularities, and maybe art will be characterized by a new kind of subjectivity. Not the classical subjectivity that you are genius or as a fantastic artist, but the idea that the subject is someone who creates very specific relationship to other fields, other forces, other domains through an artistic practice. So I think there will still be needed. We still will need art, but it will not be something which can respond to the whole society. It will not be something can take responsibility for collective idea of the future. We cannot be a part of a mass movement anymore, but we can be someone who can bring specific assemblage into the culture You could call it a micro level in a microstructure, where the architecture probably still will belong to the macro structure. Then art will in the future belong to the minor story, a smaller story, another level, which do not have the same effect to society, but maybe will be much closer to what we call a discourse, developing specific experience, developing concepts for how we can bring things together. And art will be something which can connect heterogeneity into a kind of diagram that we can deal with, and so we can reopen our society through the experience and the encounter with that very specific artwork. But I don't think that art belongs. Future art cannot. I mean, right now in Venice, you have a surrealistic approach, but you also have an environmental approach.
In Venice as a city or as a biennale?
The biennale. Mm-hmm. But can we really bring solutions? I'm not quite sure about that. But I think we can bring concept, and we can bring diagrams who can be interpreted. But we can keep the field open, so to speak.
What's your approach to art? Looking at art and then trying to somehow predict what will happen in architecture. At least this is what I think is possible.
But I think that already now there's a very close relationship between what's going on in really advanced architecture and in art.
Yeah, but this is what I think that, but because at least, I don't know, my theory is that art is more free, is, let's say, I don't want to say the word cheap, but it's cheap to produce compared to architecture. And you can try out and experiment much faster than in architecture. And thereby somehow art, I think, is always in front. And at least I see some ideas, thoughts, which were maybe 10 years ago, let's say 10 years ago in Venice, let's go back to Venice Art Biennale. They now might be today in Architecture Biennale. It's catching up somehow, always architecture. And yeah,
well,
do you agree with that?
The idea that art is more free than architecture, I don't buy that. Because if you want to create a really interesting artwork, you have to frame your practice. You have to formatting the practice in the same way that architecture has to be formatted in order to produce it. And I mean, when you're an artist, a lot of the work, I've for the time being working in the art academy here in Vilnius, one of the great tasks when you're teaching is to learn the students to formatting their practice. What are the conditions for my artistic practice? Because an artwork cannot respond to everything in the world.
You have to have your own bubble.
It has to be specific in one way or another. And I think that good architecture has a very strong formatting condition before through the model, through drawing, and through concept. And I think what we call really good art practice is also having a very specific formatting, a very specific frame. We call it in mathematics initial condition, the beginning condition for the practice before when you start to realize the work. So in that sense, I think that science, architecture, philosophy, and art are actually searching for that formatting process before you produce the final work. And so in that sense, art is not free. But it's true that we are not.
But it's a
we are not restricted by a structure which are brought into us from the beginning.
Regulations and
and things like that. We are more producing the structure. You could say we are producing a structure that is referring back to our practice.
Because I agree that in a theoretical level somehow art and architecture we could be at the same. We could discuss like now, like today. We could discuss at the same. But then I think it's theory, and then you want to make it in a practice, artistic practice or architectural practice. This is where you get shifts that in architecture you could have 10 years till you make that conversation into something. In art, you could have, I don't know, 1 year, let's say 2 years, trying out at least. And architecture also try it. In 10 years, you could try out and it wouldn't work. And for me, the best example of this is the constructivists who inspired also Libeskind, OMA, Zaha Hadid. And it has been like 50 years more apart, 60s. I don't know when they started exactly, Zaha, but 70. There's this gap, and then it somehow picks up on the same theories. You look at the blueprint of, I don't know, Libeskind and the constructivists. You don't know the difference. But then, for them it was kind of maybe almost finishing, and for the constructivists, architects, it was a starting point, that drawing, where they were trying from 2D to go to 3D, from 3D to get the function, and so on and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. So for me, it seems that we can always look at, not always maybe, but we can try to look at art, especially I think what was happening 10 years ago, and see, okay, is it possible now to do the same in architecture? And then sometimes you see, oh yeah, at that time it was not obvious, it wasn't clear, but now you can really get inspired by, and for me, I think it's very difficult. At least I don't really know if architects can inspire artists on the opposite side.
Absolutely, I think. Many of the artists that I really respect a lot, they are very, very interested in architecture. I think that I think, of course, it's possible to be inspired by the past. To give an example, a lot of modern architecture who is now designed on a computer is probably very much inspired by the Baroque architecture because of the line in the Baroque internal architecture. And now you are one of the latest North Baroque cities, so I always enjoy to see your Baroque architecture here. So I think that the Baroque is connected with the topological geometry. And the Baroque is also connected with what we call the curve geometry. Yeah. We are out of Euclidean geometry. And many modern architects are not working with Euclidean geometry, but with topological geometry, which go back to the Baroque tradition, and which is connected with what Gilles Deleuze would call the fold. Mm. And the fold, you also have the fold in Paul Klee's pedagogical sketchbooks from Bauhaus, where he's investigating what is a line, and then he brings the lines over itself, and then we have a fold. So I think that there's a strong link between, today there is a strong link between actually futurism, Italian futurism in art, and Baroque in architecture, and what I would call contemporary architecture, especially those buildings who are working with smooth movement and with a curvinality and the idea of architecture as a fold, not as a line, not as a square, not as a grid, but as a folding event. I mean, even if you go into the the new museum of Daniel Libeskind, when you go inside, you will see there is a fold inside the building. Yeah. And that is, for me, that's a kind of reference to the Baroque tradition in the city.
I see. But is it then, we are still talking about, let's say, graphical visual art and visual architecture, but then art is becoming less visual. Well, it's still visual, but it's not visual in terms of, oh, there's Matisse, it's beautiful. It's more like, what is this? I don't know. I have to read. I read, oh, it's interesting. Mm-hmm. And then how I don't know, at least for me, it's not very clear how this type of more contemporary art is connecting with architecture directly. Of course, we're talking maybe in the future we'll have growing architecture and so on, which is coming from, let's say, art of today. What artists are talking.
Reserved, yes.
Reserved.
Reserved, yes, sorry. I think modern architecture is time-based. That's the point. In the classical architecture, you have an entrance. For instance, in the Classical Art Museum, you have an entrance, and then through the spaces, the room in the architecture in the museum, you are brought from the beginning of the art history into modernity. Yeah. It's like a book. Here it begins and here it ends. modern museums of art is different. They allow the public to make their own story in the museum through a much more open spatial organization of the rooms, which means there's not a cause and effect. There's not a kind of, there's not a beginning in the house and then an end in the house. You see that in some Oriental museum of modern art, that they are building up not a labyrinth, but more like, kind of labyrinthic system between the different rooms. And
like
even
the new Tate.
Sorry?
Like the new Tate, you have the staircase.
Is and when you went to the Biennale in Venice, there was this special exhibition with surrealism. Their old works and new works was completely mixed. So there was no idea of a construction of knowledge or construction of history. There was no line of, we were very far away from the Enlightenment tradition, and we are much more into a space which can be compared with the computer.
So this is what you said.
That you go from one.
It's coming from art, maybe in a way. Art has better defined these qualities, and then now we see those in architecture.
I think that the museum has been forcing themselves to reinterpret the art history through a new way of organizing the architectural space. Now, I don't buy that idea that was very common right now in the art institution, that the art history is dead. That's a completely disaster. I don't buy that, but I buy the idea that there are internal relationships in the line of art history which are so complicated that you cannot necessarily, you have to say that there is a non-linear dimension in the art field which force the museums to create spaces which can create what we call isomorphic relationship between the past and the present and the future. Because again, back to the Baroque thing, there is a quality in the Baroque church which you can find in modern architecture. So that's an isomorphic element. So if you want to present that from in a timeline, then you maybe make a mistake because you don't see that they actually are connected on a deeper level.
But
and I think that probably a lot of architecture will try to create a space where you, as an audience, are able to construct your own narrative in the building.
This is where I was thinking to talk. I don't know how we're still, on top. Whatever. It's up to us how we
I don't know
relevant.
How much time do you have left?
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe
come with your point. Yes.
Yeah, my point is that if architecture is like becoming so open, and the creator of the space is becoming the user and so on, is it I'm sometimes asking architects also this, is it from some kind of desperation? Because God, we don't know anything anymore, and it's so changing. So let's say we are doing this on purpose, but really it's because we are in crisis and we are not sure what we are doing exactly, and we just have to be so flexible, so open that in the end we just create open space and we say do whatever because it's a great space, and then undefined spaces and.
No, but yes and no. I think that the city, for instance, will probably we will maybe consider not consider the city in the future as a site, but more like a field. Art is also going from an object to a more field-oriented thinking.
Yeah.
The whole idea of art in the expanded field is that we cannot find the final solution in a thing or in an image. We have to see the art as a field of connectivity and options. And I think the same thing with cities. Cities are zones, they are fields where complex social life can be investigated. I mean, there are cafes everywhere. Yeah. There are libraries everywhere. Yeah. You go into a cafe, you find a library.
You have a gallery in a park.
Exactly. So the classical classification of a city, that here you have the working place, here you have the exhibition, here you have school, that will disappear, and everything will be brought together in new assemblage. So I think yes and no, but we will still have in that huge knot, that huge great zone that a city is, we will still need the extraordinary. We will still need singularity, sides of high degree of intensity, high degree of sensations.
Yeah.
Sometimes it will be an artwork. We will have an encounter with an artwork, or an encounter with a process, which is an art practice. And sometimes it can be a building, it can be a space, it can be a relationship in a city. So the challenge is still there, and the challenge is harder to soil. It's becoming more and more difficult, but also more and more interesting, I think.
Exactly, because we could finish that. I think completely agree. I don't know, at least to this point, I completely agree that we have the social, let's say, need for everything everywhere. But I think still we need in society and in theoretical maybe level, but also in spaces, some triggers, some things which somebody will decide and do, and they might be beautiful for some not beautiful. But I think we still need them, and this I still see it's not terrible situation, but somehow I'm cautious on this complete focus sometimes in some academic institutions which are just social, and sometimes you're like, yeah, but shouldn't be there still this element of, let's just build a concrete box or something if we need it. Maybe we need in a huge mess a concrete box, and maybe this is the best solution. So we should still be cautious that not to go completely to this dispersed open ideas of everything is everything.
As probably the urban structure will be more and more horizontal and less hierarchic.
Yeah.
But in that horizontal structure we will need singularities, as I said before, which is very, very specific experience, and we will need something which is beyond a social relationship in order to recontextualize our social life.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will feel alone in the universe.
Yeah.
If everything is socialized, then we will be alone. We will not have anything to refer to. So that will still be how that will look like. I don't know, but that is something which we definitely will need.
So in a way,
and we will still need something that we cannot understand.
So in a way, maybe future will be more like this, but we will still need some concrete things. So at least if they are bad, we could reflect, those people who lived here 20 years ago, they built this thing, they are idiots. And we could still somehow self-reflect as a society, because if everything is constantly melting, then we don't really have so much foundations to talk about, I guess.
Well, what we see here is a morphogenetic process. Morphogenes, it's a time-based project. And I think that it's an example. I think in a way this is a crystal for how we could think the future, because what's going on here is an interaction between what is inside and outside. It's also an interaction because something is in a state where it always are in the state of becoming something else. And I think so when an object are in that state where it can become something else, then we have something interesting. When you look at that object, you have a pretty good idea of how maybe how it started to be for hours ago.
Yeah.
But you will also have a pretty good idea how it will look like in the future.
Yeah.
So this object
but
here,
not exact.
Not exact.
Yeah.
So this object here is giving access to the past, but it also gives us access to a possible future. But it can only do it because it's a singularity. It's a very, very specific experience. And if we could imagine architecture has the same quality, that we are in a frame where we have access to the environment who was, all the sketches, who was before
you
we
can
see the
still
building.
see everything,
And then you can also
recognize
anticipate the future of or how it could look like. Then you have not only access to a timeline or a morphogenetic process, but you have also access to an intellectual environment from the artist. And I think if we can reach that, then we are on the right track.
Okay, I think we are out of time. But I think we agreed on many things, and on some we didn't agree, which I think is very useful and healthy. Thank you.
It was an honor to talk to you. Thank you very much.